Tonight the topic of the talk is on the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths, or the Four Ariyan Truths, are the essence of the Buddha's teachings, the core of the Buddha's teachings. Because the Buddha said, when he understood the Four Ariyan Truths, then he became enlightened. So a full understanding of the Four Ariyan Truths leads to Arahanthood or Buddhahood. And even a shallow understanding of the Four Ariyan Truths leads to the attainment of the first stage of Aryahood, Sotapanna. That's why the Four Ariyan Truths are very important. So, before I go into the Four Ariyan Truths itself, I'd like to just talk on a few other topics which are connected with it. Because when the Buddha taught the Dhamma to newcomers, he would give a graduated discourse consisting of 9 things. The first one is dana, giving. Second is sila, keeping the moral conduct. Then the third is heaven, because dana and sila leads to heaven, rebirth in the heavens, where you enjoy sensual pleasures. Then the fourth is the danger, folly and depravity of sensual pleasures. And the fifth is renunciation. And then after that, the Four Ariyan Truths. So 5 plus 4, that's 9 things. So this was called the graduated discourse of the Buddha. The actual words of the Buddha's teaching in this graduated discourse is not found in the suttas, but parts of it are found in different suttas. So from different places in the discourses, I am going to talk on these topics. Now, any person who understands a little bit of the law of karma vipaka, which is intentional action and its result, also what is known in other religions as you sow, so shall you reap. We reap what we sow. Then we would want to carry out the right actions. And the first one is doing good. And doing good in Buddhism generally refers to giving of material things principally. And giving means letting go or renouncing our extra material possessions. So because they are extra, they are the easiest thing to do. Easier to do than keeping the precepts, because if you have extra things, it's not too difficult to give it up to somebody else who needs it. But if we don't make a habit of it, then it is not so easy also if we don't train ourselves in giving, because you can see in a child that most people are born selfish. When a child has something and you want to ask him to give it to another child or to share it with somebody else, that normally the child will refuse to do so. So as we grow up, unless we learn to give, then otherwise we cannot overcome our selfish nature, because this selfish nature comes from the feeling of the ego, the self in every one of us, and it is nature's way of protection of every species, so that we tend to be selfish. So the first thing is in doing dana, we do some good, which gives us some blessings and merit. And the second thing we want to practice is sila. keeping the precepts, learning to have moral conduct. And we learn that we have to keep the precepts in order that we do not harm other living beings. Precepts like the 5 precepts: not to kill, not to steal, not to commit adultery, not to lie, not to take intoxicants. And these 5 precepts are to be kept every day. And if we practice the 5 precepts, then we learn to renounce also the pleasures from harming other beings, because there are certain sports that we could indulge in, like hunting, fishing, where we enjoy at the expense of other living beings, and other things like drinking, seducing somebody else's husband or wife, etc. All these things that we think give us a lot of fun, give us a lot of enjoyment, but it is at the expense of somebody else, or at our expense. So we learn to give that up, and so we keep the precepts. We walk the straight and narrow path, which is of course more difficult to walk. And the Buddha also encouraged us to keep the 8 precepts, because if we keep the 8 precepts, then the chances of getting a good rebirth are very great. In addition to the 5 precepts, then we keep the 6th precept of avoiding normal food after between noon and the next dawn. As the 6th precept. The 7th precept is not to adorn the body, use perfume, etc., and not to see shows and watch, listen to music, etc. And then the 8th precept is not to sleep on high and comfortable, luxurious beds. So the Buddha said, as lay people, you don't have the time to cultivate every day like a monk, but at least once a week you should take the trouble to cultivate. And 8 precepts is training that reminds you that there are monks and nuns who spend their whole life cultivating the holy path. At least if you're not able to do that, then at least once a week you think of cultivating the holy path, because life is very uncertain. We never know when we are going to pass away. If we look around, we find that most people, they forget that life is short, and they always think that they have time. That's one of the greatest mistakes of life. We fail to realize that we don't have time. Just now, somebody was telling me, a monk was telling me that he heard that the nun Ayakema passed away 2 months ago. It was a bit surprise to me, because Ayakema just started a forest monastery, and just a few months ago, in July, I think they had their opening, and she was supposed to ordain Samanera to become a full-fledged monk. And just as the monastery is just starting, and she passes away. So you see, we fail to realize that we don't have time. So sometimes we plan this and we plan that, but don't have the time to carry it out. Life is too short. So because of that, we must remember, at least as lay people, once a week to keep the 8 precepts. Now the Buddha said, from doing these 2 things, doing good, practicing dana, giving, and avoiding evil by keeping the precepts, then it is natural for a person to be reborn in heaven. And when you are reborn in heaven, you enjoy a lot of sensual pleasures. Enjoy life as it. Life in the heavens is a very long time in terms of millions of years. So life in the heavens is one long holiday. You enjoy all the time. You don't have to work. You don't have to think of getting a job, feeding yourself, all that. You just enjoy. But the Buddha said, sensual pleasures, there is this danger, folly and depravity of sensual pleasures. What is the danger? The danger is that indulging in sensual pleasures leads to a greater craving for them. It's just like fanning the flames of desire. Another danger is that it is not permanently available, and it will end when one's blessings as a deva is used up. That is the danger of sensual pleasures. Now the folly or vanity of sensual pleasures is that the desires cannot be satisfied, and sorrowful plains of rebirth await one whose blessings are used up. So as a person, as a deva enjoys, or a devi enjoys life in the heavens, he or she is using up the blessings, accumulated from past life. As we enjoy life, we are using up our blessings bank. So one day when all the blessings are used up, and we don't have that karma of enjoying life as a deva, we will fall down, and lower planes of rebirth await us. Now the depravity of sensual desires is that it is a sickness, it is a disease, which few people understand. And the Buddha, to make us understand how sensual desires is a sickness or a disease, gave the parable of a leper in the Magandhya Sutta, in the Majjhima Nikaya. The Buddha said, there is a leper, there's a certain man is a leper, and because he's a leper, the skin, the flesh is rotting. And this rotting flesh is very itchy, so that he has to scratch himself. And as he scratches his flesh, the blood comes out because the flesh is rotting. And the more he scratches, the more the blood comes out, and then it turns to pus. And the more he scratches, more pus forms, and more foul-smelling it becomes as the flesh is rotting. And he doesn't see it as painful. Why? Because the itch is so terrible, so deep-rooted now. It's itching him right to the bones so that he has to scratch and scratch and scratch until it's all bloody. And even then, that itch cannot be satisfied. So what does he do? He goes to find some burning ember, some charcoal. The flame there's no more flame. And he uses that charcoal to burn his flesh, cauterize his flesh. So as he burns his flesh, that itchy flesh, he gets some relief from that terrible itch. And then he's satisfied for a while. But after some time, that itch comes back again. And he can't stand it, he has to scratch again. And if that scratching is not sufficient, he has to find some burning ember again, some ember to burn that flesh again, because that itch goes deep into his bones. So as he does this every day, scratching and burning, the more bloody the flesh becomes, more pus forms, more foul-smelling it becomes, and the condition deteriorates. Now the Buddha said, suppose a normal person were to do the same thing, scratch himself until the blood comes out, or take an ember and burn his flesh. Would not that be painful? Definitely that would be painful, right? But why doesn't the leper recognize it as pain? Because he's diseased, he's sick. That's why he doesn't recognize it as pain. He recognizes it as a kind of satisfaction. So in the same way, the Buddha said, all living beings are burned by the flames of desire. And because we want to satisfy these sensual desires, We do things, all kinds of things to satisfy our sensual desires, and we undergo a lot of pain and suffering. But we don't recognize it as pain and suffering because we are just like that leper. We are a slave of our passions. Right? You find sometimes a man already with a family, responsible person with children, wife, etc. Well, he'll go out of his way to carry on an affair. Why? Because he's burned by these flames of desire. He's sick, just like the leper is sick. And he has to satisfy the itch, just like the leper has to satisfy the itch. So he does all these kinds of things, going out in the middle of the night, hiding himself, and all these ways to satisfy the flames of desire. And so you can see how this parable of the leper is so accurate, so spot on. And so that is the simile to show how living beings are diseased. So existence for all of us is a long struggle to satisfy our desires from the moment we are born until we die. You see, like a child, then the simple desires for a child would be to satisfy the hunger, right? Hunger is one of those sickness of, can call it a kind of sickness that we have to satisfy. And then when a person is an adult, he has to satisfy the sex urge. Then he has to find a dwelling place to live comfortably. And then the normal things, we clothes and all that for our material comfort. And then from basic things like this, then later, after we have satisfied these basic things, then we indulge in, instead of just trying to satisfy our hunger, we look for good food, rich food. And then instead of just having a marriage partner, instead of just having one spouse, we look for extramarital relationships, affairs. And then instead of just living in a simple house, people, when they can afford it, they look for a luxurious apartment, luxurious bungalow, hi-fi equipment, Mercedes-Benz, go on holiday overseas, etc. All these to satisfy our desires. And so life is like this. One long struggle to satisfy our desires. And in the process of wanting to satisfy our desires, we labor and toil. In the olden days, people would toil in the paddy fields, in the orchards, in the forests, etc. And nowadays people toil in the office buildings, in the concrete jungles. Nowadays people use their mind to plan and scheme, compete with each other. And in the process, man undergoes a lot of hardship. Sometimes he has to take risks, sometimes even risks to his life. Sometimes in certain professions, for example, a soldier, or even an electrician, working to get a living every day is touching these wires. Sometimes he might touch a live wire and then his life will just end. And all this for the self, because of the ego, we have the self. And this self is not only this body, all those that we associate with the self, for example, my husband, my wife, my children, my parents, all this I and mine, that is the extension of the self. And then in our endeavors, sometimes we fail and we grieve and sorrow. For example, if a person is a farmer, sometimes floods occur or drought, and then his crops are wiped out, and then he'll cry and weep and beat his chest. Or sometimes, like nowadays, people do business and the business fails and it becomes a bankrupt. And also he wails and cries and beat his chest. Just like you all know, at the moment there is a recession. I was just mentioning in the car that nowadays a lot of people go to the temple and cry. Much more than before. Sometimes people break down and the family comes to a monk and see how a monk can help this person who's had a breakdown. And because of wanting to satisfy our desires, quarrels occur and fights, and sometimes even wars between nations due to greed. For example, during the Second World War, because of the greed of one man, Adolf Hitler, we had the Second World War. And in the Second World War, 36 million people were killed. 36 million people were killed, just one world war. Nowadays, if you have a world war, it will be much more because of nuclear weapons. And also because of the impermanent nature of life, we suffer in various ways. When we are separated from our beloved ones, or when our beloved ones pass away, or when we ourselves become sick, or we become old, age, or we die ourselves. Many ways we suffer, but I won't go into details because afterwards when I go into the First Noble Truth, dukkha, I'll explain that in more detail. So life is a struggle of existence from lifetime to satisfy our desires, which can never be satisfied. Just like the leper, his itch, as long as he's sick, can never go away. He can only go away for a short while. Later, very soon, he'll come back again. So, in the same way, because of our nature is such that we can never be content, we can never be contented, we can never be satisfied. Why? Because the mind is always active. You can only be satisfied for a short while. Later, you have other desires again. So we continue to suffer. And most beings die unsatisfied, with their ambitions not completely fulfilled. And because of that, because of being unsatisfied, we take rebirth again to fulfill the unfulfilled desires. According to the Buddha, there are some heavenly beings whose lifespan is millions and millions of years. And when they are about to pass away, they still have so many things they want to do. And they still want to carry out, and they still want to achieve these things. And because of these unsatisfied desires, they take rebirth again. So every lifetime we come, we have our share of suffering and lessons to be learned from life. And if we learn, we progress spiritually. If we fail, we take rebirth in a lower plane to suffer, for example, as a ghost, as an animal in hell, to learn our lesson. So life after life, we suffer. And then in the round of rebirths, as we continue to go around the cycle of rebirth, lifetime after lifetime, we become spiritually more mature. We evolve spiritually. This is not a physical evolution like Darwin's theory of evolution. This is a spiritual evolution with every rebirth. And after many lifetimes, when we are spiritually mature enough, then we have had enough of samsara. We realize that the happiness we get out of life is not sufficient to compensate for the suffering that we receive out of life. however much suffering, however much happiness we get out of life, it can never counteract the suffering that we get. Because suffering, this word dukkha, suffering or sorrow, literally means difficult to endure. And when we get sorrow, then it kind of, when sorrow hits us, it kind of blots out all the happiness we had before, as you grow older in life, then when you experience some sorrow, then you realize it's true. And suffering comes, all the happiness you had before, all forgotten, and only sorrow occupies your mind. So when a person is spiritually mature enough, he tries to find a way out of suffering, and then he starts to seek. And as the Bible says, those who seek shall find. So as we go on this spiritual search, one day we come across the true Dhamma, the Dhamma that teaches us the reality or the truth about existence. And then when we understand the basics of the Dhamma, then we want to practice the holy life. Most of us, we will start to practice it as a lay person, because it takes a lot of courage to renounce the home life, to be a homeless monk or nun. And later on, as we understand more of the Dhamma, and as we attain some progress on the spiritual path, then we would have enough courage to renounce the home life, to practice the holy path fully. And that is when we begin to understand the 4 Ariyan truths.